It's that time once again for the Pitchy and Palscast. Well, Pitchy and Palcast, Louis has done a runner on us. Unfortunately, I wanted him to be there this week. I think I'll just get right into things before letting Matt say words, because I want to prime him as a gun, locked on the target and ready to unload. What I wanted to do was continue a journey through films by the distinct, most famous directors in anime. And so, last time, we did a film by Otomo. I've forgotten his first name. I was about to say Satoshi Urishihara, and it is not him. That is a porn artist. And, yes, the week before that was, of course, Hayao Miyazaki. And Hayao Miyazaki. It was two Hayao Miyazaki films. So here's the other half of the iconic Studio Ghibli heads Isao Takahata, and a film by my favourite director, Sutter Chacon. Now, Isao Takahata worked in Toei with Hayao Miyazaki. He came into the animation industry through basically applying for a management position. He didn't have much drawing talent and didn't come in from an art school. He had a degree in French literature, which provides an influence to a lot of the aesthetic decisions he makes throughout his career. He was also very much an ideas man, and one of the early collaborations in feature film between Takahata and Miyazaki was a film called Horus, Prince of the Sun. They wanted to do a film about the history of the Ainu people in Japan, but they decided to try and make it more internationally focused, and so wound up having a bunch of Norse people. That film has 5 billion ideas and not enough time to do them all, so it's a bit of a mess. He then directed several other films, and in that time, I think I mentioned this back in the Snow White episode, he pioneered a concept called layouts. Because when you're making film, storyboarding in film and animation is basically the same. The director draws out a bunch of images, indicating key points in the plot, as well as what they want the film to look like, what sort of camera angles they're looking for, and the key images that they really want to have in the audience's mind for each scene and idea. And you do basically the same thing in animation. You draw up these storyboards, and then you just fill in the blanks between them. Takahata introduced a step in between these two for animation, because when you're working in film, you've got an idea of what you want to shoot, but you can just pull out a camera and kind of move it around and see how things look and have an idea of if it's going to work. But in animation, the time to make a good cut and the time to make a bad cut of animation is the same, and they're both really time consuming. You want to make sure that you've actually got the right idea for the angle you want, or the content you want inside the frame and so on. So what Takahata pioneered was having an interim step between storyboarding and straight up animating things, where you basically draw out a big bunch more extra forms of the storyboard to really play around with, is this the right angle? How do we actually want things to move in transition from one storyboard scene to the next? And in spending that bit more time in that phase of development, it wound up saving a lot of time in the long run, and is used by pretty much every animation studio around the world to this day. Which is cool. Takahata made a bunch of films, then helped form Studio Ghibli with Miyazaki. They eventually started to part ways within the studio and kind of became competitive rivals. Miyazaki focusing more on fancy visuals and big happy dream stories. Takahata kind of being the more rigid and serious of their storytellers. Most famously, he directed a film called Grave of the Fireflies, which is about children starving to death during World War II. And even when he's directing things like My Neighbors the Yamadas, which is essentially a sketch comedy film, there's still a bit more of this sense of rigidity to it than some of the things Miyazaki was doing around that time, like Howl's Moving Castle and Spirited Away. This all ultimately gets reversed when the last film Takahata made before his death this year was an adaptation of Japan's oldest folktale, the story of Kaguya-hime, which is this complete chaotic, visually spectacular mess. It's just very all about the feels, rather than any sort of concrete idea. So, I decided to be a bit cruel, and fling Matt his film from 1991, Only Yesterday, a film which only saw release in America in 2016. Although, being Australian, I saw this around 2006 on a Mad Men DVD. I couldn't remember if I'd seen the actual DVD or if a fan sub altered rip of it from around then. I saw it around 2006. And I think it was the actual DVD rip. So, before we get into Sutter Chacon and comparisons and type things, let's see, how can I get across the topic of Only Yesterday? Matt, give me the shortest description of Only Yesterday. It can be 1 word, it can be 10 words. Let's start small and build from there.
Boring. Hello. Did you want more than that? He said no, it was 1 word. 1 word, boring.
Yes.
There you go.
I would have chosen mundane.
Sure.
This film is a celebration of the mundane. And is that something worth celebrating in the way it does? Is that that's the first question I'm going to go with.
No.
Correct. You win a prize.
No, it's
Your
not.
prize is a Blu-ray copy of Only Yesterday. I'll just pull it out of my bag.
Please, no. You said right at the start of this podcast that Louis is not here, which he obviously is not. I'm so happy for him. I think he really dodged a bullet. It's that bit in a lot of movies or just any kind of story where like one person gets to run away, the other one is held back, and that one is saying, "Go, fly, flee, you fools!"
Are you saying that you're Gandalf, Matt?
I might be Gandalf, and the Balrog might be Only Yesterday. The demon of mundanity, the Balrog.
The ancient hordes of Morgoth.
I'm sorry, I wasn't going anywhere with that. I'm just saying, I'm happy that my friend missed out on this, is my main point there.
So, the basic premise of Only Yesterday, visually, is that it's a story about a woman who's in her mid-late 20s, and she's going for a holiday in the country because that's something she enjoys doing, and while doing so, she starts thinking about moments from when she was 10 years old that have influenced her life. And there's this neat visual distinction between these two phases of story, where there's this hyper-detailed, extremely realistic approach to the line art, the colouring, the cinematography, everything as she's an adult, and you get this more ethereal, pastel colours, very heavily washed out borders, often not really any sort of bordering at all, just this mess of white around the edges of the frame. Much more simplistic and cartoony character designs and expressions. As she's a child, so it's like, you got like this contrast between the innocence and dreamlike state that I guess looking back on your childhood can be versus the stark reality of adult life. But I think the film that is the best comparison here is Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. In that, much like Man of Steel, the flashbacks have very little connection to the present-day narrative.
Yeah. I think as well, this might just be me, but I think in some ways one of the reasons why the flashbacks don't fit with the present-day narrative is that I don't think any of the narrative really fits together in any flowing kind of way.
Is there a narrative?
Yeah. Can a narrative flow or fit if there is no narrative? That's the question this movie asks, and yeah, I would agree. The flashbacks don't fit at all in this film.
There was a metaphor you were using actually it was a simile, you used the word like at the start to describe what this film is. Given that there's numerous shots of people on trains in this film, what was this film to you, Matt?
It felt a lot like being stuck on a train with an old man who just won't shut the fuck up about farming or his childhood, and you can't escape. There's no escape, and you just have to listen to this guy meander about his life and about how important farming is to the world and his ideas on farming, and you just have to sit there and you have to listen to this. Takahata sat me down and talked to me about farming and bullshit
for 2 hours.
And
exactly
I couldn't
2.
escape. Yeah, it really felt a lot like that.
It didn't feel like 2 hours? Because it is 2 hours.
It probably did feel longer than that, to be honest. When you're in a socially awkward situation like that, it feels like an eternity. Each minute stretches as far as it possibly can go, and
you've stepped through the magic wardrobe to Narnia, and it turns out Aslan is fucking boring.
I was so bored by this. You said something that, speaking of a simile that I said, you also had a pretty good comment, was that about pin drop that never actually happened, in that I was continually like updating what I thought was going to happen in the film. Like, at first I was thinking, oh, I get it, she's unhappy with the mundanity of her life, which is why the movie is so boring at the start, and it will explore her trying to do something exciting, and that's where the plot is going to actually happen.
Reconnect with her childhood by like exploring some of the ideas that she never really explored as a child.
Yeah.
What's even worse is the film teases things like this 2/3 of the way through with, hey, I like had aspirations of acting as a child, and maybe like that'll go somewhere, and she'll like use this reflection in the country to then think about the things she could do in her city life. And instead she just says, and then I did some acting in high school and that was it, you know? And you're like, whatever.
Which really fits with that old man just meandering about. It's that kind of thing. Oh, and then I did this, and then I did that. Yeah, and when that didn't work out in the end, I was like, well, maybe, especially when the farming stuff started to come to the fore, I couldn't help but think that either the movie, like, it really felt like she was like 2 seconds away from being indoctrinated into a cult when she was talking to that guy. When
you kept asking me, is this is a cult? This is a cult, right?
Like, it felt like one. Yeah, because like he just suddenly starts like out of nowhere talking about how important it is to have like good farming techniques that's like without chemicals or pesticides or anything like that. You have to work the land, you have to work it hard, and she's like really like rearing up and ready to go to do manual labor. And then when she gets there, like there's like a moment when she gets to the farm, I mean.
Yes.
There's like this moment when I believe is it her family? Or it's a family of... No, it's his family. It's his family, the guy who brings her there. And they kind of, like, all pop up from the farm, like they're doing, like, some farming work, and they just stare at her.
Yes.
And I was like, this is a cult. This is a horror movie. This is amazing.
Yeah, it's supposed to be this uniform moment of tranquility is what the film wants to say, but there is no way to read this beyond these people have an agenda, and it's not a good one.
And so, yeah, and when that didn't work out in the end, when it turned out it was actually a tranquil, regular farm of just nice people, I guess, then I was like, is maybe, because we've watched movies like this before, like with Red Dawn, where like the whole movie is a propaganda piece for a particular worldview. I thought, is this movie trying to sway us into rural life? Is it trying to make some point about farming? Is Takahata like was he a farmer when he was young, and this is just his like mouthpiece? I was just desperate to find something that this movie was about, and I would continually update that.
Yes, I mean, to clarify, yes, this is Takahata just soapboxing about how much he loves country life. And indeed, I'm trying to remember which film it is. There is a film that he was working on where he was so fixated with some people he found digging a trench and a fjord that he shot a documentary on it. Just a live-action documentary about the process of how these people work with their fjords. Because he finds that really, really interesting. In fact, he thinks it's so interesting that he will scrap all the value in narrative as a means of grabbing your attention and keeping it and telling you ideas. The rhetoric becomes more important than the narrative in the case of Only Yesterday.
He sounds like a crazy person. Like, I haven't seen these other movies. It might not be fair, but just from this, it feels like having to watch a movie made by a crazy person who
Neil Breen's Only Yesterday.
And it's like it makes him sound like an old crazy man who just has incredible power and can make whatever movie he wants, and no one can say anything against it. Like It's like this movie is a great argument for movie by committee, because a committee would have said no to this at some point.
Yeah, it's such a shame because the craftsmanship in this film is exceptional. Every shot is just gorgeous to look at. But it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything with this. Like, art requires some form of content that you can really read something into. Like, even the point of postmodern things, like, hey, there's a bunch of bricks on the ground as an exercise in minimalism. But people will still try and read something into it. And even if you insist that it's just bricks on the ground, the fact that you put those bricks there means that it was an intended action, and thus we will read something into it. Here is almost as close as you can get in a big budget feature film to just throwing some bricks on the ground.
Yeah, I feel like there were some moments where it felt like I thought it might be going somewhere with the math issue that sort of just arrived, and because there's a moment in the film where she fails at a math test. And the editing is really strange because it doesn't show us anything but correct answers in the math test for some reason. Everyone's like, oh, she got a D, she failed. But every time you look at the math test, all I see is ticks. Like, well done. I know that's not important, but it really just weirded me out.
Yeah, well, it feels like it's going to be building something there because it's at a point in the film where there's been this recurring sense of our main character having some pretty shitty parents.
Yes.
And it feels like, so is this going to be discussing something about the way that we've been nurtured, impacting the way that we view things, and like she's going to get this country perspective because it's one so different to the suburban one she was raised in, and this will help her become more tranquil or anything. But no, she's already tranquil. She just goes, yeah. You know, I was a bit of a jerk back then, but I'm fine now. So it brings in these elements that indicate the ways that the raising of children can be damaged. But then she turns out perfectly fine anyway. Yeah. So why are these things here?
Yeah, I'm sorry to go back to the old man is talking to you on a train simile, but it instead of being like the math thing being a part of like a greater narrative, it just feels like that kind of awkward story that they throw out there. They're like, oh yeah, and this horrible thing happened to me once, and they're just like, okay.
Yeah.
Much like the bit where she comes outside without shoes and her father slaps her, which in another movie would be quite a big moment of...
Yeah, that should be a pin drop moment of demonstrating the way that she's going to contrast herself with her family's behaviour. But it doesn't do anything with this.
Yeah, so instead of feeling like a momentous, you feel awkward. You're like, oh okay. You know, that's, yeah.
I have a grandfather-in-law. My grandmother on my mother's side remarried about 12 years ago now, I think. And he is an incredibly bad storyteller who will tell the most slow, boring, stilted stories that go nowhere. He'll start telling you about a time that his brother fell asleep on a boat in the Port River, and then he woke up and he was in Darwin, had to help in the war defense against the Japanese bombing. Again, that goes places, and it's weird. The other one is sometimes he'll start telling that one, but then he'll transition to another story, which is actually about him discovering people hiding dead bodies in Port Adelaide.
What are you talking about? These stories sound amazing.
But the execution is atrocious.
Wow, fair enough.
So it's kind of the opposite to Only Yesterday, where there's no story with great execution. And those are great stories with terrible execution.
Yeah, you talked about how the craftsmanship being so good, and I would like to say, yeah, that the film is quite pretty, and I really did appreciate how the flashback scenes, it felt like something out of like a sketchbook. Like you talked about the fact there's almost feels like no border in a lot of those scenes. Like it's just white outside, or just really blue. Like, and even that's not to say that the scenes that were more realistic in the present day were not beautiful as well. Like I remember those like countryside shots just looked absolutely amazing. And I just felt really sorry for the people who must have worked very, very hard creating those scenes for zero narrative value whatsoever.
Even there's a point where, in espousing the virtues of farming, there's a point where he comments on, like, this scenery that you're seeing is made by people. And, like, that reflects on the production of the visual that you're seeing is an entirely human-made one. And certainly as a counter-narrative to the value in a lot of Ghibli films where there's a very heavy environmental focus, as we've seen the times we've gone into the studio. And here is a nice accompaniment to it, which is that people can help contribute to nature being beautiful. That there are ways that you can be involved with it directly. As beings, we are a part of nature, and that we can help foster the beauty without just entirely insisting on we must not do anything ever.
That could be a really interesting film. It'd be really nice if that was what the film was about. And not just an offhand, whoa, oh no. Oh no, the ghost of Takahata is coming for us.
He's coming, he's knocking my microphone. We're good.
Which is funny, because there will be a ghost in the next movie that we're, well, not really a ghost, but there'll be a supernatural kind of being, sort of. What was I? There was something I was, no, I've lost it, unfortunately. The ghost has knocked it out of me. Oh, yes, no. It's gone. I'm sorry, it's gone. I just have to move on.
As a note just before, I think that's about all we can really say about Only Yesterday. Hey, we got 20 minutes out of it. Is when you were making the cult comparisons, what makes it even worse is it's not like she's picking potatoes or rice or something. At that point, they're working on picking flowers to manufacture rouge with. And if there were ever this is actually a cult farm set up to be using, flowers that are a different color to how they initially grow is absolutely something you make your mind control juice out of.
They lovingly detailed how that entire process worked. They were really focused on that. I guess one point, to wrap up with is, I think the final little bit when she's essentially offered to marry the main, love interest,
Mr. Mansplain.
Mr. Mansplain.
He spends a lot of time mansplaining in this film.
That's not great. She runs off into the rain. She's not quite sure what she wants to do. She feels like a phony. She's not sure if she wants to go back to the city or stay in the rural farm. And eventually, it's raining. It's really bad. But then eventually, she gets picked up by Mr. Mansplain. And she then, as like the climax of the film, essentially, she talks about a boy that she sat next to in class for a little while. I think for about a semester or a year. And who we have not been introduced to at all.
Nope.
This is like the last 20 minutes of the film, and this is like the big climax. She's learning about herself, I guess. And this entire element comes in right at the end of the film. It's not introduced at all. It's just thrown in there.
Yeah, it's not like, say, she's trying to cherry-pick the memories from her childhood to think about.
Yeah.
And then, hey, maybe there's something lurking here that's been hinted at throughout to make you go, what is she really getting out of this experience with understanding her childhood self? It's just by the way, here's this other thing that also happened to happen and is convenient to discuss in this scene. Because again, just so few of the childhood scenes have any bearing on the arc that she goes through as an adult.
It really is exceptionally poor storytelling. That can't be overstated, I don't think. This is a really bad film.
It would be like if The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, you do your gems, you pull out the Master Sword, and then as an adult, you are a cow farmer. Instead of everything that you do is the product of being manipulated by a man who's on a quest for power and is going to exploit children who don't know better in order to achieve his ambitions, and then you as adults then have to make good on the mistakes of your past. That's the theme of Ocarina of Time, by the way. There's got no correlation here. It cannot be stressed enough.
Disconnected, poorly made, meandering, plotting. Don't watch this film.
Would you like to see his other films, Matt?
No.
Would you be curious to see his other films?
It's very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to watch any of these films any of his other films without just picturing an old man who's got me stuck in a room with him. Like, I've got a picture in my mind of what this Takahata is, and it's going to be very difficult to get that out to enjoy anything else that he might have done.
So with that, I'll actually start discussing Millennium Actress. And I think you can understand why I chose these two films together, because they both play around with temporal depictions and scenes in the past impacting the present and so on. I think I'll just start with, would you like to see more Sutter Chacon films?
No.
Okay.
I don't think I like anime. I don't think I just...
Well, I do refer to you on the Twitter as my friend Matt who hates anime.
It was like a slight moment when I was watching, I guess, Spirited Away, or I didn't hate anime for a little while.
It's gone.
It's gone now.
You're never getting it back?
It lasted 2 weeks. It would have lasted 1 week if we did a podcast last week. Yeah, no. That's the answer to that question.
Okay. Alright, I'll talk about... I'm trying to remember how I was going to start this one now. Okay, Sutter Chacon was a director at Studio Madhouse. He died of pancreatic cancer in 2010. The recurring theme in the times that he worked as a director, there's a very strong theme throughout all of the work that he directed of how we perceive reality. And there was a lot of criticism by people when he worked on films that, why are you making character designs and settings that are so photorealistic? Why aren't you just working in film? And it's because when you're painting things onto canvas, you can do so much with things like colouring to really impact a sense of unreality and how people see things and really ramp up the expressionistic elements of filmmaking. There's some small bits of expressionism at points in Only Yesterday, but oh boy, does the Millennium Actress play around with it, and all of his films do. So, the first film he directed, Perfect Blue, is, to be quick, it's about a pop idol going crazy due to capitalism. Is the quickest way to describe it. Paprika is a similar story about how capitalism destroys us. But, so, he uses perceptions of reality to really convey the sense of madness the journey of madness that she goes on. Millennium Actress uses perception of reality. I'll talk about Millennium Actress after, because I guess that's the film we're talking about. Tokyo Godfathers comes after this one, and that's a film which uses their understanding of reality to play around with coincidence, and to basically make you ask the question of, is there a divine influence in this film? Because the sheer convenience of plot beats in that film are ridiculous. Then he did Paranoia Agent, which is a TV show about people getting attacked by a kid on rollerblades hitting them with a baseball bat. It's an excellent use of television as a medium for telling weekly stories, as bit by bit all the different sorts of people who get attacked by the kid and the way that they see the world, as well as the stories we create in order to justify our own shitty behavior, and the impact that the way that telling these stories can help shape the way that we see the world. And then Paprika is again just full-on expressionism in the way that it's about the dehumanizing nature of various facets of modern society. So Millennium Actress it's a film about a documentary maker who goes to interview the lead actress of a studio that's now folded, who was their big star from the 30s through 60s. And as she's telling her life story, it frequently transforms into scenes from the films that she's in, and how the various points that are important to a little story that she goes on where she meets an anti-government dissident during World War II, which could mean that he's Japanese, it could also mean that he's Chinese. That matters less than the fact that he's a rebel. And she bumps into him a couple of times as a young girl, and this impacts her, and she gets driven by this pursuit to try and find where he went. And this impacts the sorts of stories that she wants to tell in the films that she stars in. And so the films are used to explain bits of the story by way of essentially chronicling the sorts of films that the studio is making, also doubling as a bit of a nod of a brief modern history of Japan, where, to begin with, it goes from the current time to a Warring States period one, an early Edo period, a late Edo period, Meiji Restoration, then Imperial Japan, and then actually moving into the 60s and so on, and the sorts of films she's making. And it plays around with the palette a lot for scenes which are in flashback, because as she starts explaining things and it flashes back like a film normally does, and it uses these muted colours with this accentuated red that really matches like the uniforms of the Imperial Japanese military at the time. But at the same time, the documentary maker and his cameraman are popping up with the colour palette that they had in the early stages of the film, and they start walking around inside her flashback trying to get the right camera shots for the interview. And it moves from there to the documentarian starts participating as a character in the films that she's talking about that was shot 70 years ago. I love this film. I'm a big fan of meta-text in film, and Con's work is rife with it. This was one of the films that really impacted my understanding and appreciation for such things, because I saw it when I was about 13. A bit after Spirited Away, in fact. Matt, would you like to say words?
I often, not all the time, but sometimes after we watch these films and as we're getting ready to do this podcast, I say that I'm worried I don't have anything to say. And usually it works out. Usually we find things to say and it's good.
I come prepared.
Yeah. I think this might be one of the times where it finally does come to pass, because I can't think of anything to say about this film.
Yeah, this is one where I think it seemed like this one was doing your head in as you were watching it.
Yeah.
And this is a film that's worth watching a couple of times if you want to see it, if only because once you know where it's gone, it's then easier to get a grasp of where it's been.
Yeah, I'd have to care though. I'm just struggling to find an attachment point to this film. She meets this guy who's some kind of a rebel, and it has this great impression on this young child, and because of that, she goes on an adventure, sort of, because she's going as an actress, but she wants. It
serves as impetus for her career.
Yeah, an impetus for her career. That's a good way to put it. And I get that the idea is that she was a young child, and she doesn't want to let go of that feeling. So it's a dumb love, but it's a part of it she doesn't want to give up on. But it also makes it very hard for me to really root for her, because it's just such a impossible task to find him, and I don't particularly care much for her. I don't really know that much about her, really. I don't think we really learn all that much. I don't care about her, and I don't care about her quest, and nothing in this movie made sense, or I couldn't. It felt like just after a while, it just all became noise, and it was just what scene of a movie is going to be next, and it didn't really fit to me what it was going for at any time. Or
I think there's also a bit of a problem, because a lot of the tropes that are being played around with here are Kurosawa-based tropes.
Okay.
There's a lot of Rashomon and Throne of Blood in particular popping up in a lot of the films she's in, and the elements that are appearing. So it'll be interesting maybe one day when we have a bunch of friends around to watch this again after we've gone through some Kurosawa films, and see how you're feeling about it then. Certainly the film uses... I think a lot of the emotional grounding of the film is tied to the documentarian. And certainly his cameraman is the straight man if you want to be a passive snarky guy. But it's so if you don't absorb and internalize some of the documentarian's passion as your own enthusiasm, then you're not going to form that connection with the things that he cares about. And that happens. Everyone has their own preferences in film.
Yeah. So I was trying to think of anything really to say. I wasn't much of a fan of the cameraman and the documentarian running around. It felt very, I don't know, it felt silly. It was just so dumb.
Oh, it is silly.
I couldn't work out what it was trying to do, because it could be such a a serious topic. Like, there are times when there's, like, a war going on. There are times when horrible events are happening. There's the guy who, in real life, that she wants to meet up again is a rebel in a time where Japan is not a nice place to live, and is cruelly killed by an awful police
By
force.
a secret policeman.
By a secret policeman, you know. It's just, like, really serious stuff. And then you just have this... I don't know, they remind me of, like, characters from, like, a 90s, like, action film or something like that. And it's like, this is the Rob Schneider characters. They grated on me a lot. And I couldn't tell, like... there was no logic to it. I couldn't... Like, what...
You didn't grok it, and so you were just out of it the whole time.
Yeah, so they obviously weren't retellings of the films that she was in, because the documentary guy was inserted into them. Clearly, when the movies were actually shot in the narrative of the film, that character doesn't exist. So
some form of that character might exist, though.
Might exist.
Like he's a friendly support character all the times he appears.
Yeah.
And also, there's a lot of, when it's using the film, it's in turn metaphor for the actual circumstances that are going through in her life. And at the same time, it's also foreshadowing the fact that there is a point where the documentarian, when he was an intern not an intern, he was like a third stage hand. Oh. And he actually does save the actress's life at one point in the middle of an earthquake. And so it's setting up that by doing this running gag as well.
I'm guessing that was probably, considering how this movie is, I would be very surprised to hear there was no symbolism in terms of the earthquakes. That clearly was a running theme. Was that? Could you help me out a bit there? Like, surely there was, like, a reason for that, I'm guessing. Like a theme or a reason why earthquakes was just so prominent in the film.
The certain degrees of the transience of life, and earthquakes happen in Japan.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Like,
okay.
she's... no, you talk.
You talk. Can you imagine how much more interesting Only Yesterday would have been if there was even just one earthquake in it? Mm-hmm. Like, had some drama. Nothing could have happened. It would have just, wow, something's happening. Yeah, that's all I have.
Yeah, I would say that the earthquakes really do just relate most to the transience of life, and like her life is intrinsically tied to earthquakes. She was born during the Kanto earthquake from 1918 from memory. I'm probably going to cut that date because I probably got it wrong.
You gave it a shot.
And she comes close to dying with another earthquake in 2000. So it's a form of bookending that her life is tied to these natural occurrences, as an actress who was also initially hired to be in propaganda films.
Yes. Which could have been interesting. There's so many
that
parts
earthquakes
of this film that could have been interesting. Like, someone who is forced to be an actress in a propaganda film in propaganda films, I guess, actually plural, could be a really interesting story to tell, especially if they're secretly wanting to search for someone in the places they've gone to film. Like, that's a really interesting story. That could be really fun. You know, Yeah,
you probably think that parts of this story could have been extrapolated into a whole one rather than trying to make this biopic on the holistic nature of a life.
Yeah. I was really interested as well into, like, this idea of trying to have a film industry after war-torn Japan. Like, at the end of the World War II, I was like, oh wow, I'd be really interested to hear what that might have been like. And then it didn't matter. Like, it didn't, like...
That's the point where it really starts accelerating
yeah.
into her own personal narrative.
Yeah. I couldn't even tell... Like, you had to help me out with the train when she goes to Manchuria, I believe is where she's going off to.
Yes.
Which is not supposed to be a place Japan owns, but
Japan
decided that they would.
Well, look, we've been encouraged that this colonial thing is a good idea, so let's start grabbing some land, you know? But those Korean women want to come with us voluntarily, okay?
There's a movie.
No reason to apologize.
Jesus. So she goes off to Manchuria, and they're the transition, which is funny because it was a train, from real life into movies.
Yes.
Was really tough for me.
Yeah.
And all I could think of was, when are you going to tell me what happened back on that train? Like, all I could think of was a really long time, and that probably shows as a good example for anyone who has watched this movie before. Be like, if they didn't even get that part, they'd struggle, and I did not even get that part.
If you aren't getting... Because that's the point where it really moves deep into film as metaphor.
Yeah.
Where it's like, she's then... People have picked her up from the train and taken her back to the studio and put her smack bang back into the films.
Yeah.
While she's trying to go, but she manages to... It's then couching here that, hey, there is this idea that, like, hey, she hears that the guy that she's been after is somewhere out there, but she's been pulled back and forced back into this role. And then that's when the film that she's in at that point has a creepy old throne of blood woman who's all, I've cursed you. And this image, since she's young, is one that becomes a recurring thing and something that symbolizes her regrets about the parts of her life that she never really pursued.
Well,
but then at the same time, ultimately her conclusion by the end of the film is that getting that closure is less important than the journey that she goes on anyway.
Yeah, but she has a pretty bad life. I mean, like, I don't know, I don't think this is a very happy story. I mean, the way you make it sound there is like, oh, she had a full and rewarding life, so it's okay that she didn't find her love in the end. The impetus that...
But yeah, she gets manipulated into a shitty marriage.
Yeah.
And...
She makes propaganda films. She feels lonely. And then she dies. It's not a happy film, to me, anyway. I feel like the moral of the story is, like, don't get hung up on things for 80 years and then
Life is transient, so... Let go.
Yeah. I don't know if that was what it's supposed to be. Like, it felt more, especially because, like, most of the film is quite silly. Sort of. I don't know. I can't tell what the tone is. I said that it was silly, and then all the non-silly things came rushing to my head, and I'm not sure what the tone of this film actually is.
I mean, I'll go full death of the author and say, like, okay, let's just go with your readings, and if your readings are confused, then that's going to lead to your confused feelings, and...
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Would you consider this a happy film?
Melancholy.
Melancholy. Okay. I guess it can't not be melancholy, considering it's about a woman who's recounting their life. In some way, maybe it's impossible to not have a film that is about a person narrating their life, not feel melancholy. Interestingly enough, I think most stories like that tend to, like, even Only Yesterday had a slight melancholic feeling, just because she's, like, remembering a past childhood. Yeah.
This is, we think about the things we could have done better, and thinking about the legacies we leave, and have we done anything that anyone will remember us by?
Yeah. I remember a quite fun video game, I think it's called, what's it called? King's Quest. Like the most recent one. Also has that kind of a setup to it, where it's about this king explaining to his, like, young grandkids about his adventures before he became king and when he became king. And even though that is mostly a very upbeat, like, happy kind of story, you can't help but be melancholic because it's about this old man talking about his fun life. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that ties into when I was talking about wrestling and how that's an inherently tragic medium and genre.
Yeah.
As it's one where everything's either ending before it should, or dying long after it should have hung up the boots. Which allows me to segue into my trivia for the evening. Oh, very big fan. There's a bunch of directors who will list Sutter Chacon as an influence. In particular of note is one Darren Aronofsky, who directed The Wrestler. The good one. Not the Verne Gagne one. Yes. He got to meet Sutter Chacon shortly before photography for Requiem for a Dream, which was while Millennium Actress was in production, so they just talked about pie for the most part in that meeting. He contributed to the eulogy that was written on Sutter Chacon's death, and Black Swan is basically Aronofsky's attempt at remaking Perfect Blue.
Oh, Perfect Blue. I was going to say. Because having watched Black Swan, I was like, I thought you were going to say Millennium Actress. I was like, wait a minute. Yeah. But okay. Yeah. That's interesting to know. Maybe I'm more interested now in seeing Perfect Blue. Just because I
want to show you the rest of this director's work. Because they're interesting. They do creative things with the medium of animation and the way that we frame things. Matt is scratching his head here.
Hopefully more interesting.
Apprehensive.
Millennium actress.
I think we'll cut things there for tonight, actually. Keep this a short one. Sure that you're very mentally exhausted.
Yeah, I apologize for not having any good thoughts on Millennium actress. I could imagine a lot of you who are listening to this probably are fans of anime, and hence probably do know this Sarah... How do you pronounce his name?
Sutter Chacon.
Sutter Chacon. And I'm sure maybe this is I can see this being a movie that anime fans like.
Yes.
So I apologize for not having any thoughts on it and
It's
not
okay.
really enjoying it.
This is a journey. It's the journey that's about what matters, Matt. And maybe we'll return to this several years down the road, once we've completed other journeys. I have an idea for a journey, Matt. I'm thinking later in the year, we do every Marvel movie in the build-up to Untitled Avengers movie 2019.
I'm guessing you mean every MCU movie, right? We're not going to watch every...
Yes.
We're not going to watch the
Every
old
Marvel
Captain America.
Studios movie.
Fair enough.
I mean, like the Roger Corman one. I mean, the Roger Corman Fantastic Four. That's
Yeah,
worth watching.
yeah. But every Marvel film could be a bit tough.
Otherwise, we'll see if Louis is free next week. If Louis is ready to do it again next week, then I'll do one thing. If he's not, I might do another thing. And it'll probably cause Matt a lot of pain.
What is that a promo for?
Look, I've received messages saying, is it really the Pitchy and Palscast if the pals aren't suffering? So, I'm gonna do my best to please you all.
You don't even say the movies you're doing next. You're just saying, I'm causing suffering to follow. That's the promo. That's amazing.
Of course. Look, we respect, much like Dario Cueto in his temple, we respect ancient traditions of valor, courage, friendship, and my personal favourite, violence. Alright, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
Bye.